The Kuf Ches Amid Aleph, we're a few lines into the page Shmuel Amar. The Gemara began a discussion, which we're going to continue and finish up today, is that there's a Mishnah in Shkalim that said that there were 6 pushkas. This is Shmuel Amar. It's about 9 or 10 lines into the page. I'm sorry?
I'm not sure exactly where you are.
Okay. 9 or 10 lines into the page, Shmuel Amar. So the Mishnah had said in Shkalim that there were 6 pushkas on Har Habayis. That's the 6 pushkas, and they were all for optional, that they would use the money to buy oilas, that if there was if there was time where the Beis HaMikdash was, the Mizbeach was idle by, they would take these karbanos, they would bring an optional oila. They would use all of these pushkas for the same purpose. So the Gemara is trying to figure out, why do I need 6 pushkas? And the Gemara yesterday gave 4 reasons, and now the Gemara is going to offer 2 more reasons. Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says they were corresponding to 6 different karbanos. And let me explain quickly before we begin, and this is the number 1 yesod. If a person has extra funds from a karban, now that could be because he set aside too much money accidentally, that could be the price of animals lowered, so he doesn't need to use all the money, whatever the case is, he has extra money. The halacha is like this. Most karbanos, if you have extra money, bring the same karban twice. Meaning, if I'm set aside a shlamim and I have extra money, so use the extra money to buy another shlamim. And if it's not enough, then give more money to buy another shlamim. That's the standard halacha. There's a special drasha the Gemara makes, not over here, but there's a special drasha that the Gemara makes in Shkalim, that by a chatas and an asham, extra money goes to an oila. Special drasha. So if it's a chatas or an asham, and you have extra money, it's given to the Beis HaMikdash, and they buy a communal oila. So basically, what we're going to say is these 6 pushkas are specifically for excess funds of chatas and ashams. And by the way, you have to realize, if you make this list, it means you're a chatas or an asham. Even if it may not look like a chatas or an asham, it means you're being described as a chatas and an asham. Shmuel Amar, keneged, the 6 pushkas are for the following 6 chatas and asham combinations that you can have extra funds that were dafka used for the communal oilas. Moiser chatas, excess funds of a chatas, number 1. Moiser asham nazir, Moiser asham mitzaira, Moiser minchas choite, which is a mincha of a chatas. And the daily kohen gadol's chavitin. Now the daily kohen gadol's chavitin, although it's daily, it's called a chatas in the Torah. Even though it's funny, because it's not brought for a sin offering. It's not like the kohen gadol sins every day, but it's called a chatas. So because it's called a chatas, those are the 6. Rav Oishia says, I agree with you with 5 out of 6. But Rav Oishia takes out the kohen gadol's chatas, the mincha, because he does not believe that it's an actual chatas. He says, listen, I know the Torah is calling it a chatas, but it's not coming to atone for a sin. Therefore, it does not belong in this category. And he places back in, instead of that, he places birds. If you have excess, let's say a woman is coming to bring, you're bringing birds for, an example. Let's say a woman gave birth, or a zava. She needs that to bring atonement, to allow her back in. Those birds, so he takes out kohen gadol's chavitin and places birds in its stead. So Rav Oishia, Omar, keneged moiser chatas, keneged osha, moiser asham mezazir, moiser asham mitzaira, moiser minchas choite, umoiser kinen. He takes out the kohen gadol's mincha and places birds. Now the Gemara has a quick point. Shmuel, my time why does Shmuel not like this? That sounds pretty good. Put in the birds one. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because in Shkalim, there are 13 pushkas. We're focusing on the last 6. In that Mishnah in Shkalim, in the end of the 6th parak, the Mishnah says there were 7 other pushkas, which the Gemara is not dealing with over here. One of them was for birds. So you don't need 2 bird ones. So why would I need 2 birds? Therefore, it must be birds are not making the list, and we're placing in the kohen gadol's chavitin. The Gemara says, "Shmuel my tam lamek Rav Oishia, kinin tana lereisha." There's already 1 for the birds. You don't need 2. So Rav Oishia tani v'leitani kinin, v'tani Rav Oishia v'tani kinin. So now the question is Rav Oishia. Why does Rav Oishia hold you need 2 for the birds? Why are there 2 pushkas to purchase bird karbanos? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. There are 2 fundamental differences. One is for birds, and one is for excess funds of birds. What do I mean? If, let's say, I'm a woman, I'm coming in, and I need to buy birds. So I don't have birds on me. So what I would do is I would go to 1 pushka, and it would say, like a vending machine, it would say $20 gets you a bird. So I would put in $20, a token would come out, whatever, they would give you a token, you would go to the bird part, and they would give you birds. That's one. It's not excess funds, it's to purchase the actual birds. This second pushka was if I had allocated funds for birds and I had extra, I would put it in this one, which was used for the communal oilers. So the reason why you need two birds is because they're two fundamental. One is to buy the actual birds, and one is excess funds that I set aside for birds, which are used for communal oilers, communal lambs. They didn't know, no, because first of all, there were 13 of them. There were 13 of them. The Taka were a lot of them. I'm not going through all 13. By the birds, there were. It's a good question. If you learn the end of Shkolim, there were. Yeah?
So I think that the excess one was more like for the public?
Well, the excess one was for everybody, conceptually. If you set aside money, that was extra for whatever reason.
So that person could, it's sort of like giving a donation to the club.
Well, it's sort of, but again, there's the actual buying the birds itself,
right.
And then there's if I have excess funds that was allocated towards the birds, I place it in the other one, and it's used not for birds, it's used for a communal oil.
Right.
So when you were buying your corporate tumblers, what you want to do, tumblers, let's say, or whatever, a hot dog,
Yeah.
you got a coin.
We're getting bogged down. We're getting bogged down. Let's not get bogged down. There's a separate sugi of how it was done. I don't know. Right in the Gemara. The Gemara says, why do Rav Oishia not like Shmuel, who said that the 6 was not for birds, but it was for the Kohen Gadol's chavitin? So the Gemara says, Savah Command Amar, Moiser Shel Aseres Ha'ifa Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav. He holds that the mincha of the Kohen Gadol's chavitin is not a chatas, and if you have excess funds of it, you have to let it rot. Meaning, this concept that you use the excess funds to buy a communal oil, I told you, only applies to a chatas and an asham. He believes that the daily chavitin of the Kohen Gadol, the daily mincha of the Kohen Gadol, is not a sin, it's not a chatas. It's not coming to atone for a sin, therefore it doesn't belong in the list. The Tanya, Moisar minchas nedava, the excess funds of a standard mincha is Moisar mincha yirkav. Now these words don't flow. So the Gemara says, Maika Amar, how do I read this? Amar of Chizah Hachi Kamar, this is how you're supposed to read the Braisa. Moisar minchas choite nedava. If you have excess fund for a sinner's mincha, then you use it as the communal funds for the oila. But Moiser Asir Se'efer Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav. But if you have excess funds of the daily Chavite Kohen Gadol, it's not a chatas, and therefore the excess funds have to be rat, meaning you do not buy a communal oila because you only buy it for excess funds of an oila, of a chatas and an asham. Rabbi Omar. Rabbi says, "Afilu Moiser Asir Se'efer Shel Kohen Gadol Nami Nedava." He says, "No, I disagree. I think the Braisa means that the excess funds of the Chavite Kohen Gadol is taka purchase for an oila because it is a chatas. Ela Moiser Lachmei Toida Yirkav. The example of excess funds is not of the Kohen Gadol. The excess funds that rat is a toida. If let's say someone shows up to bring a carbon toida, and instead of 40 breads, he pays for 60 breads. He has extra funds. Those 20 extra funds are not used to buy communal oilers because toida is not a chatas and it's not an asham, and therefore that rats. The Gemara says, "Beplukta." So you have a fundamental machlokes: is the Kohen Gadol's chavitin considered a chatas, or is it not a chatas? Again, the Torah calls it a chatas, but it's not coming to sin, a sin offering. So the question is it treated as a chatas for our discussion? Again, only a chatas, the excess funds of a chatas, is used to purchase an oila. So the question is, what about the excess funds of a daily chavit Kohen Gadol? Beplukta. It's a machlokes. The Braisa says, the machlokes Amarayim, Moiser Asira Se'efa Shel Kohen Gadol, Rav Yechanan Amar Nedava, Rav Elazar Amar Yirkav. It's a machlokes Rav Yechanan and Rav Elazar. Okay. Meis ve'eva kasha. Moiser shkolim chulin. If you have extra money from shkolim, you set aside instead of a machzah shekel, you set aside 3 machzah shekel for whatever reason. The halach is it's chulin. You don't need it, and it's not considered hegdish. You can keep it. Moiser asir se'efa, the excess of the asir se'efa. Now, what's an asir se'efa? The standard, asir se'efa was the amount of flour that a kohen gadol would bring daily. So pashas, that's what it's referring to. Moiser asir se'efa, umoiser kinei zavin v'kinei zavos v'kinei lados, and the excess of birds. V'chatas v'yashamos, and the excess of a chatas and asham, mosrei nedava. The excess funds are used to buy a carbon oila. So you see that asir se'efa, which Pashas is talking about, the chavite kohen gadol, is the excess funds are used to buy a nedava. My lav meiser asir se'efa shel kohen gadol, is the asir se'efa not referring to the kohen gadol? So the Gemara says lie. There was one other carbon that was an asir se'efa, and it's not the kohen gadol. It's the sin offering. A minchas chayte was also an asir se'efa, and that's what it's referring to. The excess funds of the minchas chayte is used to buy an oila, but a kohen gadol is not. Moiser minchas chayte. Amar of Nachman, Amar of Yitzchak, Mistabra, Command Amar, Moiriser, Asiris Eifa, Shel Kohen Gadol Yirkav. It makes more sense to say that if you have excess funds of the daily Chavite Kohen Gadol, it's rots. It's not considered a chatas. You don't buy an oila. It makes more sense to say it rots. Titania, as the Brisa says, Lo Yosim Aleh Shemen. It says regarding the sinner's mincha, you don't put oil on it. Lo Yitem Le Levoina. You don't put frankincense on it. Why? Ki chatasi, because it's a chatas. The implication is that's a chatas, but the Chavite Kohen Gadol is not a chatas. Rav Yehuda, he kriya chatas, vein acheres kriya chatas. Only the sinner's mincha is a chatas, but there's another mincha which is not a chatas. What's that referring to? Limeid al asiris eifa shel kohen gadol she'ena kriya chatas tu levaina. That the daily chavite kohen gadol is not a chatas. Because it's not a chatas, therefore it has frankincense, and that's why also if you have excess funds, you do not use it to buy the communal oilas because it's a chatas. It's not a chatas. Umedeina kriya chatas meiser yirkav, and because it's not a chatas, if you have excess funds, you do not use it to buy the communal oilas, but rather you have to let it rot. Okay, good. New topic. Today's daf will be doing two more mishnayos. We'll do this mishnah and then one more mishnah. This mishnah says like this. This is very important. This is, at first it seems to be a little bit not like what we said yesterday, but it's actually a fundamental difference. What we said yesterday was that if I say I have to bring $100 bull, I can't bring two $50 bulls because I said $100 bull. Easy. And we said yesterday, what if I say a $50 bull and I show up with a $100 bull? Rabbi is against it because Rabbi feels that you can't go up. You got to do exactly what you said. You can't go above. Our Mishnah is going to say the exact opposite, but our Mishnah, it's not a contradiction. Let me just explain why. Our Mishnah is not talking about the same case. The Mishnah says, Shar ze oila. If I say this shar is an oila, okay, so this $100 bull, I say this is an oila. Okay, so far so good. V'nistoev, and it gets a blemish. So what happens when it gets a blemish? You sell it and use the funds to replace it. You know what the halacha is? If I have a $100 bull and it gets a blemish and I use the funds to replace it, I can buy two $50 bulls. You say, why? I'll tell you why. Meaning instead of replacing one bull, I can get two $50 bulls. You say, but I thought yesterday we said you can't. I'll tell you why it's super different. Yesterday we were talking about, I made a neder. I said, hare alai. Alai means I have to bring a $100 bull. So I can't bring two $50 bulls. It's simple. In this case though, I say hare zu. This cow I'm responsible for. The halacha is that when you say hare zu, and then something goes wrong with it, I'm out. All I have to do is use the funds for the right reason. I'm not obligated to replace it. The difference between hare alai, I have a responsibility, or hare zu, is if something goes wrong with this animal, is it on me to replace it exactly? If you say hare alai, yes. But in this case, if you say hare zu, that means I have to bring this animal. If this animal gets blemished, okay, I'm out. Now, I really should be able to just walk away. The problem is, technicality, you have to sell that animal and use the funds for the same purpose. But I don't have to use it to replace the exact same animal. My neder is gone. Once you say hare zu, if something goes wrong with the animal, I'm out. The only reason why I have to replace it is because I now have $100 that are holy, that are allocated to this carbon. I could technically replace it with one animal. I can get 10 animals. It doesn't matter. That's the fundamental difference. The Gemara is going to speak this out, that this Mishnah is unrelated to yesterday. Because yesterday we were saying a case is hare alai. The responsibility is on me. The responsibility on you never goes away. This is hare zu, the animal. If something goes wrong with the animal, I'm out. I just have to use that funds for the same purpose because it's holy money now. So what am I going to do with it? If I say hare zu shlomim, and it's worth $100, and it gets blemished, I have to sell it. Now I have $100 cash that's meant for shlomim. What am I supposed to do? Use it on a candy? I can't. I have to use it on a shlomim. I don't have to replace the exact animal. I don't have to spend $100 on one animal. I can buy 10 animals for $10 each. It doesn't matter because I'm done. My neder is gone. I just have to use these funds for the right reason. So Zak the Mishnah, shar zeh oila v'nistav, and it gets a blemish. Imratza, if you want, yavi b'dam of shnayim. You can replace it with two animals, half the price each. It doesn't matter. Opposite also true. Shnei shvarim elu oila. If let's say I say these two $50 animals are an oila, both of them, and both of them get a blemish, I could use that $100 to replace them with one animal. Exact same halacha, just reverse. But Rabbi says I disagree. Now why would Rabbi disagree? So remember yesterday, Rabbi was like very specific, you got to keep your word. Over here also, why? Rabbi agrees, I'll just say this out, so the Gemara is going to point out. Rabbi agrees that technically I could do this. Because I said harezu. But here's the problem. Rebbe is very worried that people who are watching this are not going to understand the detail and intricacies. They're just going to see that Menachos had an animal that was worth $100, and then he shows up with two animals worth $50, and they're like, Rebbe's like, this is a bad optic. Just stick with the $100 animal. Rebbe is more concerned about it. It's like a marasayan. He's worried. Technically, what Menachos is doing is 100% fair. But people are not going to know the intricacies. They're not going to realize, oh, he said harezu as opposed to harei, and it's just going to create confusion. So do me a favor. If you said $100 animal, stick with a $100 animal. If you said two $50 animals, stick with two $50 animals. That's a Rebbe shita. It's just he wants to avoid confusion. The Mishnah continues, a similar case. Ayil ze oila. If someone says, this ram, again, zu, ayil zu oila. This ram is an oila. V'nistav, and it gets a blemish. Imratza yavi bedam of kavis. You could bring a lamb. You could replace the ram with a lamb. It doesn't even have to be the same animal, because again, it's the same concept. The second you say zoo and something goes wrong, I'm out. You just have to use money for the right proceeds for that carbon. It doesn't have to be the same animal. Keves za oila. If a person, the opposite, a person said this sheep, this lamb is an oila, in a stove, and it becomes blemished, imratza yavi bedam ayil. You can replace it with a ram. Rebbe Oyser. Correct, but it doesn't have to be the same animal. Rebbe Oyser, and again, Rebbe disagrees because again, Rebbe is consistent. He doesn't like the optic of replacing animals. It's confusing to him. Go to the next page. Okay, now the Gemara speaks out the points that I made, which is, although this Mishnah seems to not be like yesterday's Mishnayos, they're different because yesterday it was Harei Alai, and these Mishnayos are Hezu. Zak the Gemara, Ha'amrit Reisha, but didn't you say yesterday, Shar b'mana v'hevi shnayim b'mana leyatza, that if you're supposed to bring a $100 cow, you can't bring two $50 cows. So why is today contradicting that? So the Gemara says, Shar zev in shani. The answer is, this is zeh, not a lie. Okay. Continues. Rebbe said it's a problem. My taima, mishum dahavli gadol v'hevi katan v'aval gavdin estoiv l'chachil l'shari Rebbe. The Gemara speaks it out. Rebbe's against it, even though in this case it's different because it's harezu and it got a blemish. L'chachila l'shari Rebbe. Rebbe is concerned. L'chachila, don't do this. It's confusing to people. Do me a favor. Technically, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not a good idea. Okay. V'liflag nami beresha. The Gemara just has a question. The Mishnah had two cases. It said, in animals worth $100, you're allowed to place it with $250. And then it said $250, you're allowed to place it with $100. Then Rebbe said, I disagree. Why is Rebbe arguing on the second case? They're both the same. So the Gemara is going to explain, Rebbe's arguing on both cases. But Rebbe felt, let me say all your opinions, and then I'm just going to disagree, and I'm disagreeing on everything. So although he's technically only written his argument after the second case, he means to argue on all the cases. Says the Gemara, Rebbe akula milsa polik. Rebbe disagrees on all the cases. However, he waited for the rabbis to say all their opinions. So they said all their cases, they got all their shittas out of their way. And then he says, I'm just going to disagree. And when he said I disagree, he meant I disagree on everything. And the Gemara says it makes the most sense in the same flow. Keep reading the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, if you said harezu, it's a lamb, you could replace it with a ram. Or harezu, ram, you could replace it with a lamb. Then Rebbe says, I disagree. Again, he's disagreeing on both cases. He's just saying, listen, get all the opinions out, get all your cases out. I disagree. The Gemara says, Teid, I'll prove it to you, Diktani. Keep reading the Mishnah. It says, Ayil za'oil v'nestav rasi yavi b'dam of keves. Keves za'oil v'nestav rasi b'dam of ayil. In both cases, Rebbe Oyser. So you see that Rebbe is not just arguing on one case. He's arguing on all of them. He's just waiting because it's respectful. Let them say all their shittas, and then he'll disagree. Shema mina. Okay. The Gemara has an interesting question. Iboilu, I have a question. The truth is, it's a strange question because the Mishnah is pretty mafurish, but the Gemara just wants to speak it out. What happens if I said this animal and it's a cow? Can I replace it with a different species of an animal? So in our Mishnah, we said it's fine. The Gemara just wants to speak it out. And also, by the way, it makes sense that it would be fine because if you understand, again, the mechanics of it is that when you say zoo and then something goes wrong with the animal, you're out. So there's no reason why you can't replace it with a different species of an animal as long as it's the right carbon. But the Gemara just wants to speak it out. The Gemara says, Ibailuhu, memina lamina mai. Would the rabbis allow you to replace that animal with a different type of animal? So the Gemara says, Tashima. Well, look at the Brisa. Shar zeh oila. It says that if a person says this ox is an oila, v'nistav and it becomes blemish, liyavi bedam of ayil, you should not replace it with one ram. Okay? You can't replace an ox with one ram. But, avol maybe bedam shnei elim, you can replace it with two rams. Now, by the way, what do you see from here? You can replace an ox with rams. So you could go from species to species. But a quick question though, so why can't I replace it with one ram? One ram is no good. Two rams is okay. What's the difference? So it's an optic thing. This opinion feels, as we'll see in a moment, one ram, to replace an ox with a ram looks like, even if it's technically like you went to the market and you got a very expensive ram and it was a cheap ox, in people's minds it looks like you're ripping off the Beis HaMikdash. Even though you're not. But it just doesn't look right. Like Menachos showed up originally with an ox, and then the blemish happened, and I say, where's the carbon? And you're like, here it is. And it's like, that's a ram. Didn't you replace the ox with a ram? It looks like you're playing shtick. Two ram? Again, fundamentally, it should be okay whether it's one ram or two, because the concept... No, because two rams, it's like, two rams.
The two rams, the one ram might be better quality than the...
I know, but in people's minds, if I see you walking around with two rams, I'm like, yeah, that's probably the right value. One ram... It looks like, again, fundamentally, both cases should be allowed, because if the fundamentals are, when you say zoo and the animal gets blemished, you're out, it shouldn't make a difference whether it's 1, 2, or 20. This is an optic thing, and as the Gemara is going to see, this is a different version of the Rabbanan Shita, because the Rabbanan and the Mishnah make no distinction of 1 or 2. This version of the Rabbanan is a little bit worried about optics. Okay, the Gemara speaks it out. Rabbi Oisel Lefisha Ein Bila. Rabbi says you cannot replace an ox with a ram, a different species, because even two of them, because they're not mixed together in a kli. Meaning Rabbi says, I agree one's no good, because it's a bad optic, but then two's also no good, because they're not mixed together. It's like, well, if one doesn't work, why would two make it better? Now the Gemara just speaks it out. Shema Mina, you see that you can go from an ox to two rams, so you see you can go from species to species. But here's the question though, and it's Gemara speaking out what I said before. What's the difference between 1 and 2? If two's okay, one should also be okay. And the Rabbanan and the Mishnah make no distinction between one animal replacement and two animals. So the Gemara says, Trei Tanoia Liba de Rabbanan. It's two versions of the Rabbanan. You're right. The Rabbanan of our Mishnah make no distinction. This version of the Rabbanan, two students heard different things. This version of the Rabbanan are a little bit worried about optics, and they say, do me a favor, one ram is not going to look good. Two rams looks chashiv. Okay. Now, the Gemara just has one quick point. Rabbi said he's against it. Why? Because you don't mix the animals together. The karbanos are not mixed together. So if one's no good, two's not good either. Rabbi Yosef Lefisha Ein Bila. Time Ein Bila Hayesh Bila Shari. Wait a minute. That implies that Rabbi's issue is that two of the karbanos are not mixed together. But had they been mixed together, you could replace an ox with two ram? I thought Rabbi's against the whole thing in all situations. Meaning, if Rabbi's against it in all situations, why is he saying, you can't do it because the minchas are not mixed together, so it's two separate karbanos? Rabbi should just say, I'm against it. Like, clear. No, once you start giving qualifiers, like, I can't do it because A, B, and C, then it's like, oh, he would do it. No, Rabbi should just say, usser. Why is Rabbi saying, usser? Because they're two separate karbanos, it doesn't look right. Just say, usser. The Gemara says, Hatanan, Rabbi Oyser. I thought in our Mishnah, Rabbi just says it's a problem. He doesn't get into qualifiers. So why over here is he getting into qualifiers? The answer is, Trei Tanaya Liba de Rabbi. There are two different versions of Rabbi. Rabbi of our Mishnah says Aser in all situations. Rabbi of this Brisa, different students heard different things from Rabbi over time. This Brisa entertains it a little bit more. The Gemara then says, the Brisa then ends off, Upetahirim, and regarding unblemished animals, Egel v'hevi par, kevis v'hevi ayel yotza. Just in a general, if you're supposed to bring a calf, and you bring a cow, which is more valuable, yotza. Who is this like? This is not like Rebbe. If you remember yesterday, Rebbe Shita is that if you promised a $500 cow and you bring a $1,000 cow, you're not yotza. Even though it's more valuable, this Brisa permits it, which is not like Rebbe, and it's like the Rabbanan. Okay. One quick point. The Mishnah had said that if a person says this ox is an oil and it becomes blemished, he could replace it with, a different species or two smaller oxen, whatever. It says the Gemara, Amrav Menashia bar Zvid Amarav, Loi Shanu Ela de Amar Shar Ze Oila. It's dafka where you say this ox is an oila and then it becomes blemished, you can replace it with anything else. Aval Amar Shar Ze Alai Oila. But if you say the word alai, then hukva, then you have to replace it with the actual ox, with the same size ox. Meaning, if you say hare zu, then you can replace that if you want. But if you say Hare Zu Alai Oila, then Hare Zu Alai Oila. So it's weird. You're saying Zu and Alai, but if you say Hare Zu Alai Oila, you have to replace the ox with the same type of ox. You can't replace it with two smaller rams or whatever. Says the Gemara, wait a minute, why? Because you said Hare Zu Alai. But when you say Hare Zu, that means that it's this animal. Yeah, but you said Alai. The Gemara says Dilma Alai lo haviyu kamer. Maybe all you mean is like this. Hare Zu, this ox is an oila, and Alai means I have to bring it. Meaning, not that I have to replace this oila with the same type of ox, but really I'm just saying this ox is an oila. Why am I saying Alai? I'm just saying I'm going to bring this ox. It doesn't mean any different. Meaning Harezu Alai, you could just read it as Harezu. So the Gemara says, Eli Yitmar Hachi Yitmar. You're right, this is what it means to say. Amar Rav Menachos bar Zvid Amar Rav. Lo Yishanu Od Amar Shar Zeh Oila. Inami Amar Shar Zeh Alai Oila. Aval Amar Shar Zeh V'dam of Alai Oila Hukva. Very simple. If a person says, this ox and its value is on me, then if something goes wrong with that ox, you have to use that same amount to replace that same ox. Meaning, you can't replace it with two rams because you said, Hare Zu Vidam Avalai, because you're basically specifying that you want an ox of that value. So then, you're locking yourself in. Okay, we'll go to this Mishnah to the next Mishnah. It's very simple. The Mishnah says, Oimer Echad Mikivse Hekdish. A person has 5 lambs, and he says, Echad Mikvasei Hekdish. He says, one of my kvasim are Hekdish. Okay? The problem is, he didn't specify which one. So a person has a bunch of lambs, and he says, one of my kvasim are hekdesh. Here's the halacha. We assume that people like to be generous when it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, so we go to the pen. The nicest one is what he meant. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, echad mishvarei, ha'omer echad mikivsei hekdesh, ve'echad mishvarei hekdesh. If a person says, one of my lambs is hekdesh, or one of my oxen are hekdesh, but he doesn't specify which one. So if he has 2, ha'yuloshnayim, if he only had 2, ha'goloshman hekdesh, the nicer one is hekdesh, because if there are 2 of them, Mistama, he wanted the nicer one. Okay, so what do you see from here? You see from here the rule is, we always go the nicest one. Now I would say, if that's the case, it shouldn't make a difference whether he has 2, 50, or 1,000. Find the nicest one, and that's the carbon. But then the Mishnah says something a little confusing. It says, Shloisha, if he had 3 lambs in the pen, Beinani shebehem hekdesh, the middle one is hekdesh. That's strange. Why would anyone want to give the middle one? I understand you want to say he gives the nicest one. I would also argue if you wanted to tell me he give the cheapest one, because he wants to be cheap, fine. But to say the middle one, that's very strange. If there's 2, he wants the nicest one. But if there's 3, the middle one. That doesn't make any sense. The Gemara will clarify. Pirashti ve'eni yodeh ma pirashti. If a person said, I specified one of them, but I don't remember which one, if he specified which one, but he doesn't remember, then he definitely means the nicest one. Okay. So here's the Gemara's question. The Gemara is going to ask the obvious question, which is, if there's only 2 lambs, he meant the nicest one, but if there's 3, he meant the middle one. That doesn't make any sense. If you tell me that he's consistent, that he means the nicest one, he means the nicest one. But if there's 3, he means the middle one. Why would he mean the middle one? Says the Gemara, Alma Magdish bein Yafa Magdish, Ema Seifa, bein Nishiba Hagdish, Alma Magdish bein Ra Magdish. Why would I mean the middle one? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you the rule. The rule is like this. He definitely meant the nicest one. So if there's 2, you give the nicest one. If there's 3, we're concerned with the middle one. Meaning, if there's 3 of them, A, B, and C, A is the best quality, then B, and then C, A is for sure a carbon. B, where choishish is also the carbon. So what do? You don't have to bring 2. Here's what you do. You can't just eat the second one. The second one, you have to let it get a blemish. And then you transfer the holiness onto A. Meaning, so if you have A, B, and C, we definitely think he meant A. The problem is we're concerned he might have also meant B, or he might have meant B because B is nicer than C. So here's what we do. At the end of the day, he's going to bring A as the actual carbon, but you can't eat B yet. Here's what you have to do. Let B get a blemish, then say the holiness is onto A. So you're actually going to bring A, but we don't want you to just start eating B because there is a slight possibility that he meant B. I thought he meant the nicest one. Well, B is nicer than C. Even though we're not actually that legitimately concerned, but don't eat it yet, because on the off chance it might be a carbon, here's what you do. A, you put aside, wait for B to get a blemish, then say to Hashem, I'm transferring any holiness onto A. And then that's what you do. It says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel choishish and aflo bein. So what do you do? You wait for B to get a blemish, and you transfer the holiness onto A. This is not a cheap endeavor, and be careful with your words when you talk about the Beis Mikdash. Yeah, you're right. This could be very, very expensive because you lost 2 cows basically because you have to wait for B to get a blemish, and once it has a blemish, then your market. I mean, you could sell it for meat now, but you can't sell it as a carbon, as a potential carbon. So the price, you lost a lot of money. The Gemara says, "Lo yishana l'damer echad mishvarei hegdish, avol omar shar b'shvarei hagadol sheben hegdish Torah b'terai kamar." This question of maybe he meant B is only if he said echad misharai, one of my oxen. But if let's say he used the following lashon, shar misharai, the ox of oxen. The ox of oxen means the nicest one. A, no question. So now we're telling us a rule that if you use this lashon shar misharai, that means the best. Okay, it makes sense. I think that's what I would translate. If he said shar misharai, the ox of oxen, I'd be like, ooh, the most chashuv. Says the Gemara, Eini. Okay, Mareu Aliyah. Basically, let's say Menachos is selling me a house. He's got a lot of properties. He said, I'm selling you a house. I said, which one are you selling me? Beis mibeisi, the house of houses. You know what the halacha is? It's the upper story, the top story. So the Gemara assumes the top story, the attic's not chashuv. The attic's like shvach. The Gemara says, so you see that, I thought it was the nicest one. You tell me I get the attic. Attic's not the nicest one. Says the Gemara, La Mishum Degriya, isn't the attic inferior? So the Gemara says, Loi, Me'ula Shibabatim. No. When it says, it's not referring to the attic. When it says Aliyah, you don't mean the attic. It means the best of his properties. So when the Brisa said that if Menachos sells me Bayis Mebeisi, I get the Aliyah. Aliyah in Hebrew is translated as the attic. It doesn't mean attic. In this case, it means Aliyah, the most chashiv. So I look at all his properties, at least now, we assume this. I look at all his properties, he's got 10 properties. I say, okay, the most valuable one, that I got, that I bought. The Gemara eventually, by the way, just to spoil it, we'll see in 2 minutes, the Gemara eventually is going to change its mind. It actually means the attic. Why? I thought the most chashiv. The answer is, in this case, generally it means the most chashiv, but in this case, who's the burden of proof on? You see, when you deal with a carbon, the burden of proof is on you because you're giving it to God. But in this case, Menachos is the seller, I'm the buyer. It's on my burden of proof. He's in control. I'm trying to take a house from him. Hamotzi mechavero olavaraya. So even though generally it could be it's the nicest one, in this case I get the attic. I get the shvach one. Why? Because in this case specifically, because it's on me to try to prove that. Because it's on me, I don't have the upper hand. He's got the upper hand. He's the one who's got the keys to all the properties. So in this case specifically, when you're dealing with purchasing a buyer and a seller, the seller gets messed up. But in general, that terminology means the most chashuv. That's going to be the second answer the Gemara is going to get to. The Gemara says, Meisve, I have a kasha. Wait a minute. You're telling me that the word shar b'sharai means the most chashuv, but the Brisa says, shar b'shvari hegdish. Again, what's the rule? Shar b'shvari, that means the most chashuv hegdish. A, B, and C, only A. What does the Brisa say? B'chein shar shel hegdish and asar b'chein. One case is shar b'shari, so that's the case where you said the ox of oxen. Or if if a carbon of mine gets mixed in with other of my animals, so I had a carbon and it gets mixed in with the other animals, hagadol sheben hegdish. The most chashuv is hegdish. V'kulam yimchu l'tzarech eolos. But all of them have to be sold to be used as karbanos. Meaning, in this case, if there's 2 cases. I say shar b'shvari, the ox of oxen, and I have A, B, and C. The halacha is, and then it says the second case, which is I have a carbon that gets mixed in with B and C. So both cases, I have A, B, and C. The rule is A is the carbon, and B and C have to be sold to be used as karbanos. Wait a minute, I thought it's just A. I thought it's just the most chashuv. Now you're telling me all of them have to be used as karbanos. The Gemara says, Demein chulin. The Gemara says, why? So the Gemara says, you're right. The first case, shar b'shvari, just A is a carbon, not B and C. The case where you have to sell B and C as karbanos is the second case where they got mixed together. Targum asher shel hegdish and asar b'acher. V'havchein kamar. I thought it's 2 cases. Targum agadol. What it means like this: both cases, A is a hegdish for sure. A is the most carbon. The case where it gets mingled together, then you have to sell B and C as well. Meisve, I have one more kasha. We'll end with this. You're telling me that when you say shar b'shvari, it means the most chashiv. Meisve bayis bebeisi ani moichelach v'nofal. Reuven is selling Shimon a house, and he says bayis bebeisi. Right, again, bayis bebeisi means the most chashiv. and then one of the houses gets hit by gets destroyed. A tornado knocks down one of the houses. He says to me, a tornado knocked down the one I sold you. I said, no, it didn't. It knocked down the other one. Meaning, we sold a house, but we never identified which one. We just said bayis bebesi. A tornado knocks down one of his properties. He obviously claims that the tornado knocked down my property that I just purchased. I obviously claim, no, it knocked down one of your properties. So what's the halacha? The halacha is very simple. The halacha is, mariu nafal, buyer loses. The buyer has to get the rubble. Why? Because the seller says, that's your house. So the question is, why? I thought bayis basi means the most chashiv. So it's very simple. Get a real estate guy, look at the damage. He'll be able to figure out the height of the house before. You should be able to tell if it was a mansion. Look at the rubble and figure out, is it the most chashiv? If it's the most chashiv, it's mine. And if not, I mean, you can tell me bayis basi means the most chashiv house. So why is it that when one of the houses, he has 10 properties, bayis basi, we never identify which one, or tornado knocks down one of the houses, he claims it's my house and I get messed over. Why? Get in a real estate appraisal to look at all the property damage and figure out if it's the most chashiv. Says the Gemara, Mario Mace, why? Amai, lichsi haidai nafal, haidai nafal, haidai mace. Look which one it was. So the Gemara says, that's different. In general, it means the most chashiv, but in that case, the burden of proof is on the purchaser. He's trying to get the keys from the seller. Hamotzi mechavero lavaraya. Generally, you're right, that's what it means. But in this case specifically, it's a dispute where you say, I owe you nothing, and I say you owe me a house. The burden of proof is on the buyer, and I can't prove it. So the Gemara says, Lokech shani, the yad bal hashtar al tachtona. The purchaser always has the lower hand. And the Gemara says, Hashadas is hachi. Now that you go with this approach, afilu tem aliyah degriya. Back to the original case where you say, I sell you a house, I get the aliyah. I thought aliyah was the most. I thought aliyah was an attic. I thought you get the most chashiv. The answer is no. Aliyah means you get the attic. Why do you get the attic? The answer is because when you're dealing with purchasing, generally that means the most chashiv ilashon. But when you're dealing with buying and selling, the seller always wins. The Gemara says, Yad balashtar al tachtana. I will stop here. Pick it up tomorrow, B'ez Hashem.